All right, good afternoon, students. This is the 5th week of the NURS 323 Online Nursing Research course, and this week we'll be discussing qualitative research. These are the learning objectives. I want you to be able to contrast the characteristics of qualitative research with the characteristics of quantitative research. Describe 5 qualitative research approaches, the intended outcome of each qualitative approach, 4 ways that the data may be collected in a qualitative study. Describe strategies used by qualitative researchers to increase the credibility and transferability of their findings. Compare how data collected in an interview might be different from data collected in a focus group, and critically appraise the collection, analysis, and interpretation of data of qualitative studies. I draw your attention to the key terms on page 67 of your textbook. Make sure you know those key terms and their application. Okay, so if they give you a description of its application, make sure that you are clear on that, and if you're not clear on that, contact me so that we can go over that. So how does a qualitative research differ from quantitative? Okay, we spent 2 weeks on quantitative research, and now we're talking about qualitative. So qualitative is a systematic subjective approach used to describe life experiences and give them meaning. It's useful in understanding human experiences such as pain or powerlessness. Focuses on the whole. This kind of research is consistent with a holistic philosophy of nursing, and the data are not numbers. The data consist of words from the participants. I want to go back to this for just a minute. Qualitative research does not test interventions. It seeks to understand the participant's experience, okay, and it may be used for theory development. It's discovery oriented, okay? So the researcher uses the patient's own or the family's own words to capture their experiences of what they're going through. They're trying to get to a deeper meaning of the best ways to improve or intervene with patients or the family. And the results can make a contribution to evidence-based practice by integrating patient needs and values. Frameworks. When we were talking about quantitative research, we talked about frameworks that are used to help guide the researcher's selection of variables. Okay, so with qualitative research, the goal is not NOT, hypothesis testing. Goal is to capture the descriptions of life experiences from the participants and give new meaning to the experiences. Frameworks are used in a different sense in qualitative research. Each type of qualitative research is guided by a particular philosophical stance. In qualitative research, you must remember that the experience is unique to the individuals. These qualitative researchers view the experience that humans are experiencing is unique to the individual, and their perception of the experience is reality for them. So the meaning is subjective. There are many realities from individuals and groups, and time and context influence perception. The findings from a qualitative study help us to understand phenomena in a particular situation. Findings are not generalizable to the population, but the findings may be applied in other contexts or with other participants. The philosophical outlook, the philosophical orientation of the various frameworks. So here we have 5 different frameworks or approaches to qualitative research. Phenomenological research, the orientation is phenomenology. We'll go through each one of these later. Grounded theory, symbolic interaction is the orientation. Ethnographic research is the study of cultures. Exploratory descriptive research is not based in a philosophical approach. It's very descriptive. And historical research, their outlook is that lessons can be learned from the past. How does data differ in qualitative research? Data is subjective, that is, from the participant's point of view. The data incorporate the perceptions and beliefs of the researcher and the participants. The researcher must set aside their own values and experiences to discover the multiple realities of the person experiencing a particular phenomena. For example, qualitative research to understand the breastfeeding experience of a first-time mother, or the experience of someone who's just had the loss of a spouse, or someone living with a chronic disease. What are the 5 approaches to qualitative research? Okay. Phenomenological approach, grounded theory approach, ethnography approach, or ethnographic, exploratory descriptive, and historical. So when a researcher is trying to select what approach they're going to use, they will be guided by the research question that they are investigating and the purpose of the study. This helps them decide which of these 5 approaches they will use. In the phenomenological research, the method is used congruent with a point of view, which we talked about, that the experience is unique to the individual, and perception of the experience is reality for them. They view the person and the environment as interconnected. They describe human experience and the meaning of the experience to the person. And there are 2 researchers, Purcell, who is one of the leaders of phenomenological research. Purcell says that the focus of research is on the phenomenon itself, and the researcher must bracket, that is, set aside their own bias. Now, Heidegger was a philosopher and very prominent in this phenomenological philosophy. He says it's impossible to bracket. It's impossible to set aside your own biases. The researcher describes how participants interpret the experience. So Husserl would not have them trying to describe how the participants interpret the experience, but Heidegger would. Okay, the second approach to qualitative research is grounded theory research. This is a method used for discovering the basics of a situation in which little is known. And your textbook talks about Glaser and Strauss. These 2 researchers described the process of dying in a hospital, and from that they developed a theory. Theory emerges from the research findings and is grounded or found in the data. What the participants say or do and what the researcher observes about their world Okay. Ethnographic research. The focus is on people in actual cultures and in artificially occurring cultures. So an actual culture, that could be people in a remote area of United States, or remote area of Australia, or Hawaiian Islands, or something. And artificially occurring cultures, operating room. The operating room is a culture, right? Ethnographic research has utilizes two approaches, the emic approach and the etic approach. You need to know these terms, so please do. The emic approach describes the culture from the point of view of the participants, and the etic approach describes the culture focused on how the culture is viewed from the outside. So emic culture viewed from the point of view of the participants, etic a culture viewed from the point of view of those outside that culture. Fourth approach to qualitative research is called the exploratory descriptive research. They don't have any identifiable method or philosophical approach. It's used to solve some sort of a problem, often a clinical problem, and the researchers have little or no training in qualitative methods. Historical research. Okay, this is the fifth approach to qualitative research. In historical research, the researcher is telling a story of a past event from the perspective of today's knowledge and information, right? So there are studies where a nurse researcher using the historical research has gone back to investigate, discover what it was like to be a nurse in the Vietnam War or in World War II. And their sources of data are either from a primary source or a secondary source. And you should know the difference. Primary is a person or thing traceable to that period of interest, and secondary sources are someone, it isn't leaned, it's learned, someone who learned about the event secondhand from talking with other people. How is the process similar for qualitative and quantitative research? Well, both types of research require institutional review board approval. Both require informed consent and confidentiality. Both select a topic, and both state a problem or a question, and they must justify their significance of the study, why it's important. The study design is very different. Okay, we've talked about various designs, and we'll talk about some more in the quantitative research approach. In the qualitative, we talked about these 5 different approaches, and these are not used in quantitative, only in qualitative. Phenomenological approach, grounded theory approach, ethnography approach, exploratory descriptive approach, and historical. Identify and gain access to data sources. Well, the setting in qualitative research is where the people live, and context or set is very important. Selection of study subjects. Qualitative research uses a purposive sampling method. The sample is not random. The sample, which is usually a small number, is chosen for a particular reason. There's an area of interest that they want to discover more information about. For example, those new breastfeeding mothers, right? They would be selected because they are new mothers, they are breastfeeding. Okay. Gathering the data. In the qualitative research approach, the data is gathered by interviews, focus groups, observation. Whereas in the quantitative, there's usually an instrument of some kind, right? An instrument that is administered. Describe, analyze, and interpret the data. Both quantitative and qualitative research do this, but we'll go into this in more detail. Qualitative research has a very different approach to data analysis. In the qualitative approach, analysis is done pretty much at the same time as data collection. In quantitative research, the analyses are done sequentially, that is, after all the data is collected. Both need to write up their results. Here's a question for you, and of course the answer, but before you see the answer down below, try to answer the question. Which of the following is true about qualitative research? So C, the focus is on studying the whole. Okay, A would be incorrect. Categories are established for analysis purposes. No, the categories are derived after the data is collected. The data are usually collected in a lab setting. No, that's not true for qualitative research. Intuition and abstraction are suppressed. That is not true. Which methods are unique to qualitative research? Selection of subjects. We already said that the selection is a purposive sample. Someone who's experienced with the topic. Researcher-participant relationship. In qualitative research, there's a close relationship between the researcher and the participant. The researcher is trying to gain their trust and is warm, open, accepting. Data collection methods. In qualitative research, they use the interview, they use focus groups, observation, and review of documents. In terms of data management, qualitative research, they do a lot of interviewing and observation. The data is entered into the computer, a transcript or notes are prepared, and it's a huge volume of data. And this is reviewed, and the researcher becomes immersed in the data. They do use bracketing to identify and remove their own biases from the data. Beforehand, they have a plan of how to, organize the data into patterns and then code them into one file for each concept, and that is labeled. For data analysis, the data has been coded and is now examined and identified and examined to look for themes or processes or exemplars. Okay, so say breast cancer survivors, right? The quality of persistence, or the quality of trust, or the quality of sorrow. And they'll be looking at the comments that have been offered by the participants and using those words to code them into slightly higher abstract areas. In terms of interpretation, they look over this coded data and they're trying to identify themes from the codes that can be merged into even higher abstract terms. How are subjects selected? Qualitative research subjects are referred to as participants. They may volunteer to be involved in a study, or they may be selected by a researcher because of their particular knowledge or experience with the topic that they're interested in studying. Purposive sampling. You probably had this in statistics. Okay. The researcher has a topic that they're interested in studying. They only select individuals for their study if they have some experience with that phenomenon. Okay? They may seek out individuals different in some way from other participants to get a diverse perspective to enrich the data. And they keep collecting data until they have what they call a snowballing effect, where all of a sudden they're not getting anything, no new patterns are being discovered. So in purposive sampling, the researcher consciously selects the study participants. In qualitative research, this is considered the best way to gain insight into a new area of study, to discover new meaning or obtain a deep understanding of complex phenomena. And it's very different from random sampling, right? In random sampling, the sample is supposed to be representative of the population under study. And each subject is selected independently and has an equal chance of being selected. How does the sample size differ from quantitative studies? In qualitative studies, decisions regarding the sample size are based on the needs related to the study purpose. The number of subjects is usually smaller. Case studies with only one subject, even only one subject, can be used if you use a case study approach. And 6 to 10 subjects is not unusual. So the size of the sample is determined when data saturation has occurred. As I said before, at some point there's a snowballing, and they're pretty sure that no new data will be uncovered by interviewing even more people. the duration of the study. In the qualitative research, the duration of the study, it begins when the participant contacts the researcher and goes until the end of the study. And another point here, the setting. The setting may be a place where recruitment occurred, or can be a place where the data collection occurs. What are the characteristics of researcher-participant relationships? In qualitative research, the participants are treated as colleagues rather than subjects. The researcher must have the support and confidence of the participants to complete the study, and maintaining relationships is of utmost importance. What does observation entail? Observation entails asking these questions, what is going on here? What is happening in this situation? The researcher has to look and listen carefully, noting routine activities. They focus on details. They note processes as well as discrete events. They note unexpected events. They note what is said and what is not said. So the researcher using observation must be a very astute observer. What does interviewing entail? Well, interviewing is either semi-structured, meaning that the interviewer has some kind of script or a list of questions, or the interview is considered unstructured, where there's no script, there's no list of questions. Researcher says, tell me about your experience with breastfeeding. Tell me about your experience losing your wife. And the person starts to explain, and the researcher lets them go on as long as it takes, but they may use probes, that is, questions, to clarify their responses. It's an open-ended format. The researcher defines the focus. There's no fixed sequence of questions. Questions tend to change as the researcher gains insight from previous interviews and/or observations. And respondents are encouraged to raise issues not addressed. By the researcher. Here is a question for you. Data for qualitative studies are based on words rather than numbers, easy and straightforward to interpret, gathered quickly from large numbers of people, precisely analyzed on a computer. Okay, the correct answer is A, right? Based on words rather than numbers. Remember, the qualitative researcher is trying to discover meaning. Data are neither easy nor straightforward to interpret. In each approach, the purpose is to examine meaning, and the unit of analysis is a word or a phrase instead of a numerical value. How is text collected as a source of qualitative data? The text, remember I said everything that the person says is transcribed into a typed transcript. So the text is collected in this way. It may be written by the participants on a particular topic at the request of the researcher. The narratives may be solicited by mail rather than in person. Text developed for other purposes, such as patient records or procedure manuals, can be accessed for qualitative analysis, and they sometimes even look at published textbooks. What characteristics are unique to qualitative research? Qualitative data analysis occurs concurrently with data collection rather than sequentially, as in quantitative research. The researcher is simultaneously gathering the data, managing the data, and interpreting the meaning of the data. What are the goals for describing qualitative research? The goals are to become very familiar with the data. So the researcher will read and reread notes and transcripts, recall observations and experiences. They may listen to audio tapes, they may view videotapes, and they become immersed in the data. What are the four types of descriptive analysis? Reflexive thought, bracketing, data reduction, and coding. Okay, we'll go through these now. Reflexive thought. In reflexive thought, the researcher explores personal meanings and experiences that may influence study and integrates this understanding into the study. It requires conscious awareness of self. Okay? What is bracketing? Used in some phenomenological research to help the researcher avoid misinterpreting phenomena as it is being experienced by the participants. It is suspending or laying aside what the researcher knows about experiences being studied. It's a naive look at phenomena. And when they say naive, what they're talking about is it's like the first time looking at something without preconceptions, looking at it for the first time fresh. So as we said before, there's a lot of data that is collected. So how is data reduction accomplished, right? They have to reduce it in some way. So the analysis focuses on reducing the large volume of data to facilitate examination. The researcher begins to attach meaning to the elements of the data, and the researcher discovers classes of things, persons, events, and properties. Coding. How is coding? Well, coding is a way of indexing or identifying categories in the data. The codes may be placed in data at the time of data collection, or the codes may be identified when entering the data into the computer and also during a later examination of the data. Data segments can then be retrieved by coding category. What are the four types of data analysis? Coding, memos, storytelling, and narrative analysis. Okay, here's a little bit about coding. Coding, used earlier for description, also can be used to expand, transform, and reconceptualize data, providing opportunities for more diverse analyses. How are memos helpful? Memos are helpful because they're used to record insights or ideas related to the notes that have been taken, the transcripts that have been typed up, or the codes. It moves the researcher towards theorizing and are conceptual rather than factual. Memos may link the data or use specific piece of data as an example of a conceptual idea. So, qualitative research on chronic sorrow in multiple sclerosis patients, right? Individual pieces of data are linked together and raised to a higher level of abstraction in the form of a conceptual idea. So specific examples from someone with multiple sclerosis, they're not left at that lower level, they are raised to a higher conceptual level. Which of the following is not a common data collection method in qualitative research? Examining written text, interviewing participants, observing participants, obtaining written surveys. The answer is D. Survey research is a type of quantitative research. Data collections methods in qualitative research include observing participants, interviewing participants, and examining written text. Storytelling. Storytelling can be instructive in understanding a phenomenon of interest. It includes a sequence of events with a beginning, a middle, and end. Stories have their own logic and are temporal. What is narrative analysis? It's a qualitative means of formally analyzing stories. The researcher unpacks story structure. They can be used to determine how people tell stories, how they shape the events, how they make a point, how they package events and react to them, how they communicate their stories to audiences. Okay, so let's just say a qualitative researcher is talking to someone who was a nurse in the Vietnam War and saw action. The person would tell a story, and the story would be transcribed, and the transcript would be examined by the researcher to look at the structure underneath it. And they're looking at how they shape the event, how they make a point, how they package it and react to it, how they communicate it. How does the researcher interpret qualitative results? The researcher offers his or her interpretation of what is going on. Okay, the researcher does not include their biases, right? But they do offer an interpretation of what is going on. And the focus is on understanding and explaining beyond that which can be stated with certainty. It may focus on the usefulness of findings for clinical practice. The researcher develops hunches about relationships that can be used to formulate tentative propositions. So rigor, how clean, how neat, how tidy, how strict the study has been carried out. Okay. In qualitative research, we've talked about the openness of the researcher and between the researcher and the participant. The qualitative researcher has to adhere strictly to a philosophical perspective. They have to provide great detail in the design of their study. This is how rigor is obtained. And when someone is reading a qualitative research, they're looking for this. evidence of openness, evidence of adherence to the philosophical perspective. What evidence, what detail has been provided in the design of the study? What detail has been provided in terms of the thoroughness in the collection of the data, in the data analysis? Have they given consideration of all data in subjective theory development phase? What are the causes for lack of rigor? Well, one cause would be inconsistency in adhering to the philosophy of the approach being used, failure to get away from older ideas, poorly developed methods, insufficient time spent collecting the data, poor observations, or failure to give careful consideration to all the data. Here's a term, decision trail. This means using the same data. Someone who is reading a journal article, one can follow the logic of the original researcher and arrive at the same conclusions. Okay, a decision trail. It's clear how they came to this conclusion because they have provided all the steps that led up to the conclusion. It requires the researcher to establish rules for categorizing data, arriving at ratings, or making judgments. Rules are evident in the report or the write-up of the study. So nothing is left to the imagination. So the reader of the study knows exactly what the researcher had in mind. What are the requirements for decision trails? For decision trails, a record must be kept of all decision rules used in the data analysis to support the study's conclusions and emerging theory. All raw data are stored and available for review as requested, or if requested. Data are stored securely and the data is de-identified. So the data has to be under lock and key. If it's kept on a computer, the computer has to be securely maintained. If not locked up, and if otherwise it is locked up. And the data is de-identified, meaning the data, the name of the person is not revealed. The data is identified only by number. Now there's an unfolding case study that you may wish to pursue, and they go through they put you working in an outpatient dialysis unit. You're interested in exploring how patients cope with the time constraints of the procedure, and you decide to conduct a search for the evidence and see if there are interventions that have worked for other populations, patients that may be helpful to your population. So I'll ask you please to go through this and let me know if you have any questions on this. All right, so let's go back to the beginning. These were our learning objectives. Your exam 2 will have approximately 10 questions on qualitative research and approximately 10 questions on quantitative research. So you can start preparing now and have your questions ready. Send me your questions. I'll be glad to hear from you. All right. That is the end of this integrity. Thank you.